There's a company that told the entire world it was untouchable, and for 30 years, almost everyone believed it. This is the story of how that empire cracked, quietly at first, then all at once, and how the people who fought back finally won. Somewhere inside a courtroom in Brussels, a lawyer read out a number so large it silenced the room. 10% of global annual revenue, nearly $25 billion, hanging over the head of the most powerful software company on earth, like a blade that never falls, but never disappears either. And if that sentence just made your stomach tighten, stay with me, because this story is only getting started, and by the end of it, you are going to see the tech world completely differently. For decades, one company decided what software you used before you even opened your laptop. It decided what email client greeted you in the morning, what document editor your job required, what operating system booted up the second you pressed power, and if you ever tried to walk away and use something different, something better, something cheaper, that company had already built a wall designed specifically to make sure you never left. That company is Microsoft, and for most of modern computing history, resisting them felt like resisting gravity. But something has been happening quietly over the last few years, something most people scrolling past headlines have completely missed, and it is this. The world is finally, genuinely, measurably winning against Microsoft. And the evidence is not a rumor or a conspiracy theory. It is sitting in legal filings, market share reports, and internal memos that Microsoft never wanted you to read. Rewind to the late 1990s, when the United States government took Microsoft to court in one of the most explosive antitrust battles in American history. And prosecutors proved something damning, that Microsoft was using its Windows monopoly as a weapon, deliberately crushing a rival browser called Netscape, so that Internet Explorer could dominate without ever having to compete fairly. A federal judge was so disturbed by the evidence that he ordered Microsoft broken into 2 separate companies. That order eventually got reversed on appeal, but here's the part nobody talks about. The damage to Microsoft's reputation never healed, because the world had just watched the playbook up close, lock people in, bury the competition, apologize just enough to survive, and repeat. And decades later, that exact same playbook is being used against them again, except at this time, the opponents are smarter, the regulators are hungrier, and the technology battlefield has shifted into territory Microsoft never saw coming. Fast forward to 2020, a workplace messaging app most of you have probably typed a message into this week. Slack filed a formal complaint with the European Union, and the accusation was simple, devastating, and impossible to ignore. Microsoft was secretly bundling its own chat app, Teams, directly inside Office 365 and Microsoft 365, the same productivity suite hundreds of millions of employees around the planet are forced to use for work. You wanted Word? You got Teams whether you asked for it or not. You wanted Excel? Teams came along for the ride. You wanted Outlook? Teams was already installed, already logged in, already sitting there, quietly stealing market share from every competitor that had to fight for every single customer the hard way. The European Commission opened a full investigation, and for years, Microsoft tried to wriggle out with cosmetic tricks, offering Office without Teams here, tweaking a pricing tier there, hoping regulators would get tired and move on. They did not get tired. In May of 2025, Microsoft came back to the table with more concessions, and on September 12, 2025, the European Commission made history. They accepted Microsoft's legally binding commitments, and the empire finally bent its knee. Microsoft was forced to completely unbundle Teams from Office, forced to sell cheaper versions of Microsoft 365 without Teams attached, forced to let customers walk away from Teams whenever they wanted, forced to make sure rival apps like Slack and Zoom could actually function properly inside Microsoft's own ecosystem, and forced to let users export their own Teams data straight into competing platforms. And here's the detail that should genuinely shock you. These are not soft promises with an expiration date next quarter. These commitments are legally binding for 7 years, with some obligations stretching all the way to 10. And if Microsoft ever breaks the rules again, the penalty is not a fine. It is closer to a corporate death sentence, up to 10% of their entire global annual revenue, which at Microsoft's current scale could reach nearly $25 billion in a single strike. That is not a slap on the wrist. That is a guillotine positioned directly above their neck, and it is never coming down. If this is the kind of story that makes you want to see corporate giants actually held accountable, stay close, because the cloud war is where things get even more brutal. For years, Amazon's cloud platform, AWS, sat comfortably as the undisputed king of cloud computing, and Microsoft's Azure came roaring up from behind, closing the gap so fast that analysts genuinely believed Azure might eventually seize the crown. But look at what the numbers actually say heading into 2026. AWS still commands roughly 31% of the global cloud market. Azure trails at 24%, and Google Cloud, the youngest of the 3 giants, has quietly climbed to around 12%, and raw market share is only half the story because the growth curves tell something far more dramatic. In the fourth quarter of 2025, Google Cloud exploded with 48% year-over-year growth, pulling in $17.7 billion in revenue, its fastest expansion in 4 years. AWS accelerated too, hitting 24% growth in that same quarter, its fastest pace in 13 straight quarters, and both of these giants are gaining ground on Microsoft in ways that should be sending genuine alarm through the halls of Redmond. The gap between AWS and Azure has narrowed, yes, but it has never closed, and Google Cloud is now climbing at a velocity so steep that the cloud landscape of 2030 might look nothing like what Microsoft executives promised their shareholders when they bet the entire company's future on Azure. But here's the twist that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most humiliating detail in this entire saga. The operating system quietly running the modern internet is not Windows. It never was. It is Linux. And even on Microsoft's own cloud platform, over 61% of virtual machines are running Linux, not Windows. Pause on that for a second, because it deserves to sink in on Microsoft's own infrastructure. Built by Microsoft, sold by Microsoft, branded with Microsoft's name, the majority of workloads have abandoned Windows for the operating system Microsoft once mocked, feared, and tried to destroy. On Google Cloud, the number climbs to 91.6% Linux. On AWS, it sits at 83.5%. Globally, Linux now controls 44.8% of every server operating system on Earth, and the trajectory says it will cross 51% before the end of 2026. The open source movement that a former Microsoft CEO once publicly called a cancer has become the invisible backbone of the entire digital world. And that is not just a technical footnote. That is one of the most staggering reversals of fortune in the history of the technology industry, a 20-year revenge story nobody scripted, but everybody is now living inside of. And just when you think the cracks could not spread any further, artificial intelligence walked in and turned Microsoft's story from uncomfortable into genuinely alarming. Microsoft made one of the largest financial bets in corporate history, pouring billions of dollars into OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, and then wired that partnership into every corner of its empire under one brand name: Copilot. Copilot in Word, Copilot in Excel, Copilot in Teams, Copilot baked directly into Windows itself. Microsoft spent over $60 million on television advertising for Copilot in 2025 alone, standing in front of the world, promising that this was the tool that would finally transform productivity forever. And then something deeply uncomfortable happened. Almost nobody actually used it. Reports surfaced in late 2025 revealing that Microsoft had quietly slashed its internal sales targets for AI agents by up to 50% because real-world demand had collapsed far below what leadership expected. A Gartner survey delivered an even more brutal verdict. Only 6% of enterprises had successfully pushed generative AI projects out of the pilot phase and into actual daily production, meaning 94% of companies experimenting with tools like Copilot were still stuck in limbo, and fewer than 4 in 10 employees who even had Copilot access were bothering to use it regularly. Microsoft had spent tens of billions of dollars building the infrastructure, licensing the technology, and marketing the dream, and they slammed straight into an adoption wall that refused to move. Then came the moment that turned embarrassment into something far more serious. In December of 2025, a report from The Information exposed internal communications in which Microsoft's own CEO, Satya Nadella, sharply criticized Copilot's integrations, reportedly admitting that the connections between Copilot and tools like Gmail and Outlook simply do not work properly and are not intelligent. Sit with the weight of that admission for a moment. The man leading a $3 trillion company was privately confessing that his flagship AI product, the one his company had staked its entire future narrative on, was fundamentally broken. Nadella reportedly took the extraordinary step of personally becoming Copilot's de facto product manager, stepping directly into the weeds to try and fix what billions of dollars and years of engineering had failed to deliver. When the chief executive of one of the most valuable companies on the planet has to personally intervene to save a single product, that is not a minor technical hiccup. That is a 5-alarm crisis playing out in real time. And while Microsoft scrambled internally, its rivals moved in for the kill without mercy. Google folded its Gemini AI assistant directly into Google Workspace Business and enterprise plans completely free of charge starting in January of 2025. Microsoft, meanwhile, charges an extra $30 per user per month for Copilot, stacked on top of an already existing Microsoft 365 subscription, and independent benchmarks suggest Gemini actually outperforms Copilot in reliability and multimodal tasks. Cisco pulled the same move, folding its own AI assistant into WebEx Suite at no additional cost. Microsoft built a wall around its AI and charged a toll to walk through the gate, While its competitors tore the wall down and simply invited everyone inside for free and in enterprise budgeting meetings around the world, that difference is landing like a hammer. Then, on June 1st of 2026, disaster struck publicly. Microsoft's Copilot suffered a massive outage that locked enterprise customers completely out of their AI. Workflows and IT teams discovered that every standard fix, clearing cookies, signing out, switching networks, did absolutely nothing. The outage exposed exactly what critics had been warning about for months. When businesses become fully dependent on a single AI vendor woven into every corner of their operations, one failure does not simply cause inconvenience. It paralyzes entire companies. And when that vendor is Microsoft, a company whose own CEO had already publicly admitted the product barely functioned, the outage landed like a thunderclap rolling through boardrooms everywhere. Organizations are now seriously exploring multi-vendor AI strategies, deliberately keeping backup licenses with Microsoft's competitors, because trusting a single company with everything has quietly become too dangerous a bet to make. And if you want to see how deep this goes, step back and look at the entire battlefield at once, because what is happening to Microsoft right now is not one skirmish, it is a full siege from every direction simultaneously. In artificial intelligence, Copilot is being humiliated by free alternatives from Google and Cisco. In cloud infrastructure, AWS remains ahead, while Google Cloud grows faster than Azure ever has. In server operating systems, Linux has quietly conquered the internet Microsoft once ruled unchallenged. In regulation, the European Union has legally forced Microsoft to dismantle its own bundling strategy. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority is closing in on Microsoft's cloud licensing practices, and the American FTC has opened a sweeping investigation into Microsoft's AI dominance. And in enterprise adoption, even the companies that paid full price for Copilot licenses cannot get their own employees to use the product. This is not a company facing one crisis. This is a company under siege on every single front at the exact same moment in history. And it is happening in plain sight. But here's the twist that makes this story so much more interesting than a simple victory lap. Microsoft is not collapsing financially. Not even close. Revenue hit $76.5 billion in the fourth quarter of 2025 alone, up 18% year over year, and Azure crossed $75 billion in annual revenue for the first time in fiscal year 2025. The money is still pouring in by the truckload. What is actually breaking is not the balance sheet, it is the illusion of inevitability. The quiet, unquestioned assumption that you use Microsoft because there simply is no real alternative. And that assumption has just been shattered. For the first time in decades, there are credible, well-funded, legally protected alternatives sitting at every single layer of what Microsoft sells, and that is a different kind of losing entirely. A slow erosion of the myth that made the empire feel untouchable in the first place. Think about who actually fought for this moment. The open source developers who spent 30 years building Linux in their spare time with no corporate backing. The regulators in Brussels and London who spent years assembling a legal case piece by piece. And the competitors like Slack, Google, and Amazon who simply refused to accept that Microsoft's dominance was some kind of permanent law of nature. Salesforce, the company that acquired Slack for $27.7 billion in 2021, did not sit back and accept a second-place position as inevitable. They filed the EU complaint, they fought through years of grinding regulatory process, and they walked away with a legally binding victory. Salesforce's own chief legal officer called the ruling a meaningful step forward, stating plainly that Microsoft's tying of teams to Office had harmed businesses and stripped customers of fair choice for years, and that is not the language of a company that lost, that is the language of a company that fought a giant and actually won. The open source community deserves its own chapter in this story because they were the original rebels, fighting Microsoft's dominance decades before a single regulator ever noticed. In the late 90s, Linux was something a handful of developers tinkered with on spare laptops in their bedrooms, while Windows sat installed on hundreds of millions of corporate desktops and server racks. Nobody in the boardroom took Linux seriously as a genuine threat. By 2025, Linux quietly controlled 90% of public cloud infrastructure across all three major providers combined. And by the end of 2026, it is projected to cross 51% of the entire global server operating system market. Microsoft spent years trying to smother this movement before it could grow, publicly calling Linux a cancer, lobbying hard against open source licensing and engineering proprietary file. Formats deliberately designed to make Linux and other open alternatives harder to use, and every single one of those strategies eventually failed, because thousands of unpaid, uncredited developers around the world simply kept building, kept refining, kept giving their work away for free until the quality and freedom of open source software outcompeted everything the world's richest software company could throw at it. And that is one of the greatest underdog reversals in the entire history of technology. And underneath all of it lies the single force tying every part of this story together: artificial own. Intelligence did not just create new products for Microsoft to sell, it completely reshuffled the power structure of the entire industry overnight. Before AI, Microsoft's advantage was simple: own the operating system, own the productivity suite, own enough of the cloud, and dominance basically takes care of itself. But AI created an entirely new battlefield where the resource that matters most is not what software you already have installed on a billion machines. It is which AI model is the most capable, the most trustworthy, and the easiest to actually use. And on that new battlefield, Microsoft bet everything on a single partner: OpenAI, wrapped inside a single product, Copilot. Google built Gemini from the ground up on its own infrastructure and its own research. Amazon quietly wove its own AI capabilities directly into AWS. And open source AI models from companies like Meta handed developers the freedom to build powerful systems without ever depending on a single gatekeeper again. The wall that protected Microsoft for 30 straight years has not fallen completely, but it has never stood thinner, and the people trying to climb over it have never been stronger or better funded. The world is winning against Microsoft, not completely, not permanently, but genuinely, measurably, and undeniably. And the proof is not hiding in some obscure corner of the internet. It is sitting inside courtroom transcripts in Brussels, inside cloud market share reports updated every quarter, inside the leaked internal words of a CEO forced to admit his own flagship product simply does not work, and inside adoption numbers that reveal employees would rather do nothing at all than pay $30 a month for an AI assistant they do not trust. It is sitting inside regulatory investigations spanning 3 continents at the exact same time, closing in from every angle at once. The grip that once felt permanent, unbreakable, inevitable, is loosening in real time, right now, in front of everyone, and it finally feels like a choice again. And when people are given a real choice after decades of having none, everything about an industry begins to change. This fight was never just about one messaging app or one antitrust ruling in Brussels. It was always about what the internet itself becomes when it grows up. Because when a single company controls the operating system, the productivity tools, the cloud, the AI assistant, and the developer tools all at once, that company does not simply dominate a market. It quietly shapes how every single business on Earth thinks, communicates, builds, and survives. And that kind of invisible influence is worth fighting to break, which is exactly why these antitrust victories matter so much more than their individual rulings suggest. The European Union forcing Microsoft to unbundle Teams was never just about giving Slack a fairer shot. It was about proving, in a court of law, that even the most dominant company on the planet cannot weaponize its existing power to smother competition in the market next door. And that single principle now echoes into every unresolved fight still ahead, into the UK's cloud licensing investigation, into the FTC's inquiry into Microsoft's AI partnerships, into every boardroom on the planet quietly asking whether building an entire company on top of Microsoft's infrastructure is still the safe bet it used to be. These are not just wins for Slack, or for Google, or for a handful of open source developers who never asked for credit. They are architectural changes to the very rules of competition itself, rules that Microsoft now has to live inside whether they like it or not. And for the first time in a generation, that empire is no longer writing the rules alone. And if you think this pressure is confined to Europe and quietly fades out the moment you cross an ocean, look again, because the United Kingdom is running its own separate campaign, and it might end up being even more consequential than Brussels. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority spent over a year digging through Microsoft's cloud licensing contracts, the fine print buried inside enterprise agreements that almost nobody outside a legal department ever reads. And what they found was damning. Terms specifically engineered to make it dramatically more expensive for a business to run Microsoft software anywhere other than Azure. Try to run the same Windows Server license on AWS, on Google Cloud, on Alibaba Cloud, and suddenly the pricing shifts against you, penalties appear, discounts vanish, and the message becomes unmistakable: stay inside our walls or pay a premium for daring to leave. That is not competition. That is a tax on freedom. And regulators finally called it exactly what it is. The CMA is now actively weighing whether to designate Microsoft with something called strategic market status, a formal label that would hand regulators sweeping new powers to dictate how Microsoft prices its products and treats its rivals going forward. Meanwhile, the Federal Trade Commission opened its own sweeping investigation into Microsoft in late 2024, demanding internal documents on AI training costs and the exact structure of the multi-billion-dollar relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI, because regulators are asking a question that should terrify any monopoly: Is this partnership actually a disguised form of control, a way to dominate the most important technology of the decade without technically owning the company that built it? And the very same century-old antitrust law that dismantled Standard Oil and reshaped AT&T is now explicitly being pointed at the entire generation of AI-era tech giants, with legal scholars openly drawing a direct line from the Microsoft trial of the 1990s to what could become the defining antitrust battles of this decade. Now step back and look at what Microsoft has actually been spending to try and win this war, because the sheer scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend. In just the second quarter of fiscal year 2026, the quarter ending December 2025, Microsoft spent approximately $37.5 billion on AI infrastructure alone, a single financial quarter. And that spending pace puts the company on an annualized run rate of nearly $150 billion a year. Analysts at Jefferies looked at Azure's growth numbers and called them genuinely extraordinary. And then, almost in the same breath, asked the question that should worry every Microsoft shareholder: can this pace actually be sustained once competitors finish scaling their own infrastructure and start undercutting Microsoft on price? Azure's remaining performance obligations, essentially contracts already signed for future revenue, reached a staggering $625 billion, a number so large it sounds fictional, except here's the catch nobody wants to talk about. 45% of that entire figure is tied directly to Microsoft's relationship with OpenAI. Strip that single partnership out of the equation, remove OpenAI from the picture even hypothetically, and Azure's dominant story suddenly looks far less unshakable, resting on one relationship that regulators are actively investigating for potentially violating fair competition law. No competitor in the history of modern technology has ever coordinated an attack this precise, and yet it happened almost entirely without coordination. Dozens of separate actors, separate governments, separate companies, separate open source communities, all independently arriving at the same conclusion: that Microsoft's dominance was never actually earned through superior technology. It was engineered through lock-in, and lock-in only survives as long as nobody challenges it directly. Somebody finally did, and then everybody else followed. There's a deeper psychological layer to this story too. Dominance built on fear of switching costs is fundamentally different from dominance built on genuine loyalty, and for 30 years, Microsoft never had to learn the difference because it never needed to. Employees complained about Windows updates breaking their workflow mid-deadline, but they kept using it because switching felt impossible, and an entire generation of enterprise software was built on a foundation of resignation rather than enthusiasm, a foundation that turns out to be incredibly fragile the moment a real alternative appears on the horizon. Consider the France story for a moment, because it rarely gets the attention it deserves. The French National Gendarmerie, an entire branch of the French government's law enforcement apparatus, migrated tens of thousands of desktop computers away from Windows and onto Linux years ago, not as an experiment, but as a deliberate, strategic decision rooted in cost savings and a desire to reduce dependency on a single foreign technology vendor for critical government infrastructure. And that decision has quietly saved the French government tens of millions of euros since. When a national police force decides it can no longer justify staying locked inside Microsoft's walls, that sends a signal far louder than any antitrust ruling ever could, proving that the alternative is operationally viable at massive scale. Germany is walking a similar path, committing hundreds of millions of euros toward reducing its dependency on foreign software vendors, a trend accelerating across the European Union. Now rewind back to the corporate battlefield for a moment, because the Copilot story keeps getting more uncomfortable the deeper you dig into it. Internal Microsoft documentation reportedly showed that even inside Microsoft's own walls, among its own employees, who theoretically had the strongest incentive in the world to champion the product, adoption remained stubbornly low, and morale around the AI push grew increasingly strained as engineers were pressured to integrate Copilot into products faster than the underlying technology could actually support reliably. That is the quiet tragedy hiding underneath the flashy $60 million advertising campaign. A company telling the entire world that artificial intelligence had arrived and transformed everything, while privately its own workforce struggled to make the technology function as promised inside its own products. And here is the truly staggering part of this entire narrative, the part that ties every thread together into one devastating picture. Microsoft is not failing because it lacks resources. It has more capital, more engineers, more data centers, and more market reach than almost any company in human history. Microsoft is struggling because the era of guaranteed dominance through lock-in has structurally ended, replaced by an era where genuine product quality, genuine trust, and genuine openness now determine who wins each individual battle, market by market, quarter by quarter. And no amount of bundling, no amount of advertising spend, no amount of aggressive licensing terms can manufacture trust that has to be earned the hard way. That single shift may end up being remembered as one of the most consequential turning points in the entire history of the technology industry. The exact moment when the world's most powerful software company discovered that its old playbook, the one that built a $1 trillion empire, had finally, permanently stopped working the way it always had before.